morning and welcome back. This is World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Sally Jastrzębska. Trump administration's policies and rhetoric have had far-reaching effects not just in the United States, but globally, influencing everything from trade agreements to national security. As this week draws to a close, there is much to discuss, starting with J.D. Vance's trip to Greenland. To do so, I have Scott Lucas, professor at the University College Dublin, joining me here right now. Good morning, Professor. Delighted to have you with us.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
So before we discuss Greenland, let me ask you about Myanmar in the context of the recent dismantling of US AID. How do you see American assistance for Myanmar? And do you think that other countries such as China might want to capitalize on this and perhaps step in?
Well, I think you've summarized that very well. I mean, clearly we have the immediate question of a disaster response by countries across the world in terms of trying to assist those in Myanmar and Thailand who are affected. China is very close to Myanmar, so they can provide that assistance fairly quickly. The United States has provided disaster assistance in the past, including, you might remember, some years ago when there was a devastating tsunami that hit Thailand. But because of the Trump administration's approach to foreign aid across the board, not just disaster assistance, but health programs, programs to help local economies, programs to help with education, because the Trump administration is trying to gut all of those, the U.S. is effectively walking away and allowing other countries to go in to help people, and that, of course, is the priority here, but of course to make themselves looking good doing so. So if there is a soft power benefit from this tragedy, it won't go to the United States. It will go to a country like China or other countries that might step in, including those from Europe.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of U.S. diplomacy, J.D. Vance, his recent trip to Greenland, it was not a success. What shall we make of that? And can we say that J.D. Vance is perhaps becoming the face of the U.S. turning on its allies? I mean, Greenland, but, you know, places like Canada. Also, we have the EU. How do you see this?
Well, you can call J.D. Vance Donald Trump's attack dog. You can call him his chief bully. He is there to publicly present the idea that the U.S., the Trump people themselves, should have their own way, and other countries in Europe should simply comply with what they want. So specifically, when he goes to Greenland, he's reinforcing what Donald Trump said earlier this week, which is the U.S. has to have it. Now, Vance stepped away from the idea that the U.S. is going to invade, use military force to seize Greenland. He indeed said that the U.S. will not annex Greenland, but he said Greenland is going to become independent, and then they're going to link with us. They're effectively going to become part of, the greater United States. He had no regard for what the people of Greenland want, let alone, of course, what Denmark, who, of course, is a sovereign country, and Greenland is part of that country at this point, what they want. This is just simply part of the Trump administration's broader approach, which is there are no rules here in terms of international relations. They simply are what the U.S. demands, almost like a mafia boss, and other countries are supposed to comply.
Mm-hmm. And how do you see this situation developing? I mean, how could it develop? I find it hard to make sense of.
Well, in a specific sense, I don't think anything really changes beyond Vance's rhetoric on Greenland. I mean, it's up to the people of Greenland and to the people of Denmark what they want. At this point, there are many people in Greenland who want independence from Denmark. The recent elections put into power a coalition which took office just hours before Vance's trip, which have stated that they would like to have this independence, but that coalition and almost all people in Greenland have also said that independence does not mean we want to be part of the United States. Indeed, if anything, the approach by Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, I think, has increased antagonism against America across Greenland. When American officials went door to door asking if someone would let J.D. Vance and his wife Usha into their house for a photo opportunity, not a single person said yes. That doesn't really affect U.S.-Greenland relations, but it's a marker of what is happening. In a wider sense, however, this is quite serious. It is quite serious because it is not just simply showing a disregard for what Greenland or Denmark wants. It's part of J.D. Vance in particular saying, I don't care what Europe wants. I don't care what Europe wants to do in terms of its military, its economy. In other words, it's a wider symbol of that there is no functioning alliance between the Trump administration and European partners for the first time in U.S. history since 1941.
Mm-hmm. Well, paradoxically, maybe the U.S. actions could bring Greenland and Denmark closer, right, as they're trying to put a wedge between them. But I wanted to ask you about Greenland, Panama, and Canada. Do these places have anything in common? I mean, Trump called Prime Minister Carney a governor at some point, right?
It's power beyond anything specific, and that is that Donald Trump sees power, again, not in terms of a win-win relationship working with other countries like Poland. He sees it as a win-lose relationship. In other words, I want to take something and you should give it to me. Now, in each of those specific cases, you could talk about, for example, with Panama, the Panama Canal, this vital waterway. That certainly is an interest. But of course, the Panama Canal operates because of a cooperation up to this point between the U.S. and Panama. There is a treaty under the Carter administration in the late 70s that confirmed it is part of Panama. You could talk about Canada in the sense that the U.S. and Canada have been the closest of allies in the past in terms of a security relationship and economic relationship. But Trump simply wants to take money from Canada. He wants to take goods from Canada. And yes, he would genuinely like Canada to give up its sovereignty and become part of the U.S. And in the case of Greenland, there are rare earth minerals, there are raw minerals which are in interest, and Greenland has a very strategic position given its, in the Arctic waterways. So yes, there are interests that are there, but those interests, of course, ironically have been protected by cooperation between the U.S. and Greenland. Look at where J.D. Vance was yesterday. He was at one of the largest U.S. military bases in the world, which was established as part of the Cold War and continues to operate today.
Right, that is true. And speaking about these other countries and tariffs, let me bring in the topic of tariffs. Prime Minister of Canada mentioned introducing retaliatory tariffs, and then J.D. Vance, whom we've been discussing, said that they simply don't have the cards, and this is a direct quote from him. So what do you think could happen, and is perhaps the U.S. too light-hearted about other countries, taking actions in retaliation to what they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, this was J.D. Vance in response to Canada saying we may carry out reciprocal or retaliatory tariffs, posing like a bully, which is, oh, go ahead, try to hit me. You can't hurt me. And it ignores a basic point, and that is there is no winner in a trade war. Everyone loses. So yes, the U.S. can punish the Canadian economy and indeed the global economy with the tariffs on steel and aluminium, with the recent tariffs on cars. We see how much wider those tariffs will go on April the 2nd. Will they be across all sectors, across all countries? But other countries will then respond with their own tariffs, which will hurt the United States. And at the end of the day, manufacturers, consumers, farmers in all countries will suffer because of this. And it will be interesting. It will be interesting if and when Americans realize that they are the ones that will pay higher prices because of the tariffs. They were the ones whose companies will be affected, whose farms will be affected. And will that wind up, rather than benefiting J.D. Vance as he tries to act like a bully, will it wind up hurting him and Donald Trump politically?
Right, and isn't it already? Because, I mean, the U.S. stock market has certainly taken a hit, right, with Dow being down 700 points last night. So, of course, the economy is already reacting. So how do you see this developing from here? Shouldn't they, put the brakes on what they're doing?
Well, the Trump administration is not going to listen to me or you about putting the brakes on, but I think you're right to point to the idea that there are some blinking red lights about the U.S. economy, that the inflation rate is edging up again back towards 3%. It had been dropping steadily under the Biden administration down to around 2.5%. Interest rate cuts are likely to be suspended because of the concerns over the effects of tariffs. You are seeing a relatively stagnant job market at this point. And significantly, you have seen one of the sharpest drops in consumer confidence. In fact, it's at its lowest point since November 2022. Now, so far, that hasn't brought a serious collapse of the U.S. economy. That's not what I'm talking about, but it's starting to erode. And if you talk about what that means politically, Donald Trump's approval rating was about 50% when he took office. Now it's still about 47.5%, but his disapproval rating is up from 41% to almost 50%. So those people who are not diehard Trumpists, they are, those who are thinking, I'll wait and see if Trump helps me out, they're starting to get the jitters. And I think that's going to accelerate through the rest of 2025.
But even in the deep red places, I feel like Republicans may be facing some challenges. I'm talking here about the special elections taking place in Florida. We'll know the results, I believe, on Tuesday. But they do feel insecure, I mean, the Republicans, right, about their majority in the House.
Yeah, they definitely feel insecure in terms of what is a 3-seat majority in the U.S. House of Representatives, that lower house. And we had a symbol of that this week, which one of those Republican representatives, a woman named Elise Stefanik from New York, was supposed to become the U.S. ambassador to the UN. And Donald Trump withdrew her nomination. Why? Because if she went to the UN, there would have to be a special election to fill her seat. And there's a fear that the Democrats would win it. There have been a couple of significant state elections that the Democrats have already won, overturning significant Republican majorities. So yes, I think despite the fact that the Democrats are still in a bit of disarray in terms of how they respond to Trump, despite the fact that Trump and his unelected co-president Elon Musk are just running roughshod over the U.S. government and its agencies, I think there are the signs politically of trouble for the Republicans if they do not try to draw a line on how far Trump is going with his destruction.
Professor, we do have to wrap up, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on one other issue, and that is freedom of speech in academia in the U.S. We've just heard that the Columbia's university president resigned after the college had to make some concessions to the Trump administration. Of course, we see people being detained right across the country. So what are your thoughts on that? Shall we be seriously worried about the crackdown on certain aspects of academia in the U.S.?
Yeah, there's a dark irony here, which returns us to J.D. Vance, the vice president, who has continued to assault Europe as supposedly being the threat to free speech, completely distorting what happens here, including in my country, in Ireland. When in fact, what you were seeing on American campuses is the threat by Trump officials to seize and deport students, to seize and deport faculty members, to completely cut research budgets. And that includes vital research that saves lives, for example, scientific research. And why are they doing this? Because there are students, there are faculty members who have criticized or expressed concern about Israel's attacks on Gaza. They have not done anything illegal, but simply expressing concern about that is now grounds to have them deported. That universities have actually tried to study issues such as what happens in the Middle East, and that those programs are considered a threat by the Trump officials, and that even by talking about diversity or equity or inclusion, you may in fact be considered unacceptable and face at least financial, if not security consequences.
This is very unsettling. Professor Scott Lucas, thank you so much for being with us this morning, despite this difficult topic. Thank you. And thank you for watching.
Thanks to you and your viewers.
And thank you for watching World Talks. Please stay tuned for more here on TVP World.